The Rolex glittered under a hailstorm of camera flashes, gold catching the light like a small mocking sun. $150,000. I know that number by heart now because that filthy photograph was sitting right there on the front page of a glossy magazine, the caption practically singing with pride. A rising young lawyer named Marshall Langley, gifting a vintage Daytona to his billionaire father-in-law. The boy looked polished, successful, generous. There was just one small problem. 4 days earlier, that same generous lawyer, the son I bled myself dry for, the son I sold my late wife's life insurance policy for just to cover his law school tuition, had looked me dead in the eye through a FaceTime screen, sighed like a man being asked to donate a kidney, and sworn to God he could not spare $3,000 to save the only home I had left from foreclosure. He told me he was tightening the belt. I thought the deepest betrayal a man could survive was watching his own blood trample everything he sacrificed for. I was wrong. The truth behind that watch, and the reason a proud, untouchable billionaire showed up pounding on my door at midnight 3 days later, was about to teach me something far worse. I hadn't raised a son. I had spent my whole life fattening a parasite. And tonight, that parasite was finally going to pay the bill. If this story is already making your blood boil, hit that like button right now and subscribe. If you're new here, you're about to want to see how far this goes. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching this from tonight. Now let's go back. Let's go back to where it all started, 40 years ago, in a classroom that smelled like chalk dust and cheap coffee. My name is Theodore Langley, and for 40 years I stood in front of teenagers who didn't want to be there, trying to convince them that Shakespeare and Steinbeck mattered more than the phones buzzing in their pockets. I taught American literature at a public high school in a town nobody outside of it could find on a map. I was never a rich man. I was never going to be a rich man. But for most of my life, I was, at the very least, a proud one. My wife Rosalind taught third grade 2 buildings down from mine. We met in a teacher's lounge that smelled permanently of burnt coffee, and were married 11 months later in her parents' backyard under a maple tree that's still standing there today, though the house beneath it hasn't belonged to us in years. We had one son, Marshall, and from the moment the nurse placed him in my arms, red-faced and screaming at a world he hadn't asked to enter, I made a private, foolish vow. Whatever door that boy wanted opened, I would tear my own hands apart, finding the key. I need you to understand something before I go any further, because it matters for everything that comes after. I do not regret loving my son. I regret bitterly, completely, who I allowed that love to turn me into. Rosalind got sick when Marshall was 16. Ovarian cancer, stage 3, the kind of diagnosis that empties a house of laughter one appointment at a time. We fought it for 2 years. I sat in fluorescent-lit waiting rooms, grading essays with shaking hands, trying to hold on to something ordinary while our world came apart. I watched the woman I loved disappear a pound at a time, watched her stop recognizing her own reflection in the hospital bathroom mirror, and when she finally died on a gray November morning, I did the only thing that made sense to a man who had run out of ways to protect his family. I cashed out her life insurance policy, money that was supposed to be my safety net for old age, and I funneled every last cent of it into keeping Marshall afloat. Grief counseling, tutors, anything that might stop a boy who just lost his mother from drowning too. He got into Harvard Law 2 years later. I still remember the exact sound he made when he tore open that acceptance letter, something between a sob and a laugh, pure and young and completely unguarded. It is, I realize now, the last truly honest sound I would ever hear my son make. Harvard Law does not care about a public school teacher's pension. The financial aid package covered a fraction of the cost, and the rest was mine to find. So I did what any father who had already buried his wife would do. I mortgaged the house. Not just any house, The wooden house my own father built with his hands after coming home from Korea. The house where Rosalind and I raised our son. The house that held 40 years of birthday candles and Christmas mornings burned permanently into its walls. I signed those papers without letting myself hesitate, because hesitation felt like a betrayal of everything I'd already given up. I took a second job grading standardized tests on weekends, hunched over a kitchen table at midnight until my eyes blurred. I stopped buying new clothes and wore the same 3 tweed jackets until the elbows wore through to the lining. I drove a 2005 Honda Civic with a check engine light that never once turned off, because turning it off cost money I didn't have, and pride I could no longer afford to spend. 4 years later, Marshall graduated. I flew out in my one good suit, sat in a folding chair under a blazing Massachusetts sun, and cried like an idiot when they called his name across that stage. I believed in that single golden moment that every sacrifice had finally paid its dividend in full. I had no idea I was watching the last scene in which my son and I would ever stand as equals in his eyes. Marshall took a position at a corporate law firm in Manhattan, the kind of place with marble lobbies and a dress code stricter than the military's. Within a year, he was dating a woman named Isabel Whitmore, and if that surname means nothing to you yet, it will by the end of this story. Isabel's father, Randolph Whitmore, had built a real estate empire out of nothing but ruthlessness and impeccable timing, the kind of man whose name is etched onto buildings, whose signature moves markets, whose disapproval has quietly ended careers with a single phone call. Marshall married into that world 18 months later, in a ceremony that cost more than I earned in 3 full years of teaching, a ceremony where I sat at a table near the kitchen doors, introduced to guests when I was introduced at all, as Marshall's father, a retired teacher, said in the exact same tone you'd reserve for recovering alcoholic or estranged relative. I told myself that was fine. I told myself pride was a luxury I'd already spent, along with everything else, on getting him there. But something shifted after that wedding, something I was too grateful, too desperate to keep believing in the fairy tale, to name out loud at the time. Marshall stopped inviting me to things. Not all at once. It happened the way a tide goes out, so slowly you don't notice the shoreline has moved until you're standing ankle-deep in mud where there used to be water. First it was the small dinners. Just a work thing, Dad, you'd be bored. Then it was holidays, a Thanksgiving spent with Isabel's family, obligations, you understand. Then it was the phone calls themselves, which shrank from weekly to monthly to the kind of call that only ever happens because I am the one dialing. I remember one afternoon with painful clarity. The 2 of us at a restaurant near his office, one of the rare lunches he still granted me. A colleague of his stopped by the table, shook my hand, asked what I did. Marshall answered before I could open my mouth. My father was in education, he said. Was. Past tense, as if I had already died and only my ghost had shown up to embarrass him over appetizers. I laughed it off at the table. I did not laugh about it in the car afterward. I found out, almost by accident, that Marshall had thrown a launch party for his own private practice. 200 guests, an open bar, a write-up in a regional business magazine, and I hadn't been invited. I learned about it through a friend from church, a woman who assumed I already knew, who watched my face fall in real time, and mercifully changed the subject before I had to explain that I hadn't. I understand now what I refused to understand then. To Marshall, I had become an inconvenient chapter in a biography he was busy rewriting. My tweed jacket with the worn elbows, my rusted Civic, my modest little house on a street with no gates and no doormen. These were not sentimental artifacts of the life he came from. They were evidence. Evidence of an origin story he was desperate to erase. Proof that could unravel with one careless introduction. Everything he had built in front of the Whitmores and their glittering circle. I told myself again and again, lying awake in a house that had gotten far too quiet. that this was simply the cost of success. That children grow, that they move on, that a good father lets go without complaint. I told myself Rosalind would be proud of what our sacrifice had built, even if the boy who benefited from it could no longer bring himself to look me in the eye in a room full of people who mattered to him. I was a literature teacher for 40 years. I taught tragedy for a living. I stood in front of restless teenagers and explained semester after semester exactly how pride blinds a man to the wound, bleeding him dry right in front of his own face. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being erased by someone you built with your own two hands. And I lived inside that loneliness for years, quietly, without ever once saying the word out loud to another living soul. Not to my sister, not to my pastor, certainly not to Marshall himself. I simply absorbed it, the way I had absorbed every other bill life had ever handed me, and kept teaching, kept grading, kept believing that somewhere underneath the tailored suits and the Manhattan address, my son still remembered whose hands had built the ladder he climbed. I never once thought to apply the lesson to myself. Not yet. That would come later, on a night when the phone finally rang and everything I had spent a lifetime refusing to see came into focus, violent and absolute and impossible to unsee. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in a plain government envelope, the kind that has never once in the history of the Postal Service contained good news. I almost didn't open it right away. I remember setting it on the kitchen counter next to a stack of ungraded quizzes and making myself a cup of coffee first, some old instinct in me already flinching from whatever was waiting inside. Property tax delinquency. That was the phrase printed at the top in a bureaucratic font that somehow managed to feel both bored and merciless at the same time. I owed back taxes on the house, the same house my father built, the same house I'd mortgaged half my life to keep afloat while Marshall built his. And the letter was polite enough to spell out exactly what would happen if I failed to pay. $3,000. 10 days. After that, the county would begin foreclosure proceedings, and the only home I had left in this world would be auctioned off on a courthouse lawn like a piece of used furniture nobody wanted. I sat down at my kitchen table and read that letter 4 times, as if repetition might soften the deadline, might shrink the number. It didn't. The math of my life had finally, quietly caught up with me. Every dollar I had ever earned had gone somewhere else. Into Marshall's tuition, into his wedding gift, into the unspoken expectation that a father simply keeps giving until there's nothing left in the tank to give. I had nothing in savings. My pension checks covered groceries, utilities, and apparently not even the property taxes I'd fallen behind on without fully realizing how far underwater I already was. $3,000 might as well have been $3 million. I spent that first night pacing the length of the house, turning the number over and over in my head like a stone I couldn't put down. I thought about selling the Civic, but a 15-year-old car with a dead check engine light wasn't going to fetch a fraction of what I needed. I thought about a second mortgage, but the first one had already stripped the house of nearly all its equity years ago, back when Marshall needed it for tuition, and I never once thought to ask what would be left over for me. I thought about asking my sister, but she'd retired on a fixed income down in Florida and had less to spare than I did. Every road I walked down in my head that night led back to the same uncomfortable destination, my son. Somewhere in that sleepless pacing, I stopped in the hallway in front of an old photograph. Marshall, at 8 years old, missing his front teeth, grinning up at me from the driver's seat of a toy fire truck I'd spent an entire Saturday assembling on the garage floor. I remember thinking almost absurdly that the boy in that photograph would never have let this happen to me. That boy used to save his birthday money in a mason jar labeled for Dad without me ever once asking him to. Somewhere between that mason jar and a corner office on the 40th floor, something inside him had been quietly, completely replaced. The way a tree can be hollowed out from the inside while its bark still looks perfectly healthy from the street right up until the storm that finally knocks it down. I want to be honest with you about something because I promised myself I would tell this story straight without flattering my own dignity. I did not want to call Marshall. Some wounded, stubborn part of me would rather have slept in that dying Civic than ask him for anything ever again after years of being quietly written out of his life, his parties, his introductions. But it wasn't my pride on the line anymore. It was the house, Rosalind's kitchen, where she used to hum old radio songs while she cooked. The maple tree out back that Marshall used to climb as a boy, scraping his knees, laughing the uncomplicated laugh of a child who still believed his father could fix anything in the world. 40 years of a life I could not simply stand by and watch, get stamped sold on a courthouse step while strangers picked through what was left of it. So I swallowed what was left of my dignity, and on a Thursday evening I called my son. He picked up on the fourth ring, and I could hear, even before he said a single word, the particular texture of background noise that told me he was somewhere important. The low murmur of a restaurant, maybe, or a rooftop lounge, glasses clinking somewhere behind him, laughter that wasn't mine. "Dad, hey, kind of a bad time, can I—" "It's important, Marshall," I said, keeping my voice as level as I could manage. "It'll only take a minute." There was a pause, the specific kind of pause a man makes when he's already calculating how to get off a call before it's even really begun. I explained it as plainly as I could. The letter, the 10-day deadline, the $3,000. I told him I hadn't asked him for a single cent since the wedding, and I wouldn't ask again after this. I just needed help keeping the house through this one crisis. What came back was not sympathy. It was a sigh. Long, theatrical, the exhausted sigh of a man being asked to donate a kidney to a stranger on the street. "Dad, $3,000 right now is just— it's not possible. Isabel and I are stretched incredibly thin. You have no idea what it's like out here right now. Inflation, the market's been brutal. Oliver's private school tuition alone is eating us alive every single month. You're going to have to figure this one out yourself. I can't keep bailing you out." Bailing me out, as if the man who had sold his dead wife's life insurance policy to put him through Harvard Law was somehow the one who had spent a lifetime taking. As if 40 years of sacrifice had been quietly reclassified, somewhere in my son's mind, into a debt I owed him, rather than the other way around, entirely. I stood in my kitchen, phone pressed hard against my ear, and for a moment I genuinely could not speak. Not because I lacked words. Because I had too many of them, all of them sharp enough to draw blood, and some last dying scrap of a father's instinct kept me from turning a single one loose on my own child. "I understand," I finally managed, because what else was there left to say to a man who had already made up his mind before I'd finished my first sentence? "I'll try to figure something out for you when things calm down," Marshall said, already distracted, already halfway back to whatever table or deal or version of his life he'd stepped away from to take this call. "I have to go, Dad. We'll talk soon." The line went dead before I could answer. Not hung up gently, not with a goodbye. Just gone, the silence on the other end, somehow louder than anything he'd actually bothered to say. I stood in the middle of my kitchen for a long time after that, phone still in my hand, the letter still on the counter beside a stack of quizzes I would never grade that night. I looked up, and there, on the little shelf above the stove, was Rosalind's photograph, the one from our 20th anniversary, smiling at me the way she always smiled, patient and warm and completely unaware of the man her son had grown into. "I'm sorry," I whispered to a photograph, though I couldn't tell you, even now, whether I was apologizing to her for failing to raise him better, or apologizing to myself for 40 years of mistaking sacrifice for love. I did not cry that night. I want you to understand that clearly, because it matters. I was long past crying. What settled into my chest instead was something colder, quieter, and infinitely more dangerous than tears. The first small, sharp seed of a question I had spent my entire life refusing to ask out loud. What exactly had I raised? And what did it say about me that I hadn't seen it coming sooner? I turned off the kitchen light and went to bed, with $3,000 I didn't have hanging over my head like a blade, with absolutely no idea that the true insult, the one that would finally completely shatter whatever illusions I still had left about my son, was only 3 days away, waiting patiently for me on the glowing screen of a second-hand iPad my grandson had left behind on the living room couch that same weekend. 3 days after that phone call, I was sitting in my recliner with my grandson Oliver's old iPad on my lap, the one he'd left behind after a rare weekend visit. A visit, I should mention, that Marshall had arranged without ever coming inside the house himself, dropping the boy off at the curb like a package that needed signing for, and picking him up the same way 48 hours later. I wasn't doing anything important that evening. I was scrolling through old family photos I'd saved to the cloud years ago, trying to remember what my son's face used to look like before it learned to look past me instead of at me. Somewhere in that idle scrolling, a notification slid down from the top of the screen. A Society magazine account, one Isabel apparently followed, and Oliver's account, linked somewhere in the settings to hers, had inherited it without anyone ever bothering to filter what a 6-year-old's tablet showed him. A charity gala. Diamond sponsors. The kind of black tie event where a single floral centerpiece probably costs more than my entire monthly pension check. I almost swiped it away. I want you to know that. I almost didn't look. I was tired, and grief has a way of making even curiosity feel like too much effort. But something, call it instinct, call it the universe deciding I hadn't suffered quite enough humility for 1 week, made me tap the photograph instead of dismissing it. And there he was, Marshall, in a tuxedo that fit him the way only tailored things fit, his arm draped casually over the shoulder of a silver-haired man I recognized instantly from wedding photographs years earlier, Randolph Whitmore. Both of them were grinning for the cameras, champagne flutes raised, the picture of two powerful men who belonged, without a shred of doubt, in the same glittering room. And between them, held up for the photographers like a trophy, was a watch, gold, gleaming under the flash of a dozen cameras at once. The caption did the rest of the damage for me. In bright, cheerful little letters I will remember until the day I die. Rising star attorney Marshall Langley surprises father-in-law Randolph Whitmore with a vintage Rolex Daytona valued at $150,000 to celebrate his 60th birthday and years of mentorship. I read that caption 4 times. I did the math without wanting to, the way you can't stop your own hand from touching a bruise. $150,000. 50 times the amount he'd told me 3 days earlier he could not possibly spare to keep his own father's house out of foreclosure. Not 50% more, 50 times over. My hands were shaking by then, though the room was warm. I set the iPad face down on my knee for a moment, just to breathe, just to give my heart a chance to slow from whatever gallop it had worked itself into. I thought about Oliver, 6 years old, asleep somewhere in a penthouse 200 miles away, wearing pajamas that probably cost more than my weekly grocery bill, completely unaware that his private school tuition had apparently been cited 4 days earlier as the reason his own grandfather might lose the roof over his head. None of this was that little boy's fault. I want to say that clearly, because nothing that follows in this story is about punishing a child for the sins of his father. Whatever else Marshall had become, I would not let my anger touch the one part of him that was still, somehow, entirely innocent. I sat perfectly still in that recliner for what felt like a very long time. I want to tell you I screamed. I want to tell you I threw the iPad across the room, that something in me finally erupted the way it probably should have erupted years earlier. But that isn't what happened. What happened was quieter and somehow far worse. The grief I'd been carrying for years, the slow, patient grief of a father watching his son become a stranger a little more with every passing season, curdled, right there in that recliner, into something colder and infinitely more focused. Rage doesn't always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it arrives like ice water poured slowly down the back of your collar, filling every corner of you at once, and leaves you sitting perfectly, terrifyingly calm on the outside, while something irreversible happens underneath. I thought absurdly of King Lear. 40 years of teaching that play to bored 17-year-olds. 40 years of explaining to teenagers who cared far more about lunch than literature how an old man gives away everything he has to the children who flatter him best, only to be left standing in a storm with nothing, while the one daughter who loved him honestly gets nothing but scorn for her silence. I used to tell my students that Lear's real tragedy wasn't the storm, it was his blindness. The fact that he could not tell the difference between love and performance until it was far too late to matter. I had taught that lesson for 4 decades. I had never once, not for a single second, suspected I was living inside my own private production of it. Isabel's tuition, inflation, the market's been brutal. I ran his excuses back through my head, one after another, and set each one down beside that photograph, and watched every single one of them dissolve into nothing under the weight of that number. Marshall hadn't been broke. Marshall had been calculating. He had looked at 2 competing investments, his own father's survival and a piece of jewelry engineered to purchase favor with a man who could hand him a seat on a board, and he had chosen, without a flicker of visible hesitation, the watch. I thought about all of it then, in one long, unbroken current, the way a drowning man is said to see his whole life pass before him. Rosalind's insurance money, the mortgage on my father's house, the second job grading tests until my eyes ached under the kitchen light. 40 years of tweed jackets worn thin at the elbow, and a Civic with a check engine light that never once turned off. I had told myself for so long that all of it was an investment in my son's future, a father's sacred duty, simply the natural order of things a parent doesn't question. Looking at that photograph, I understood with a clarity that felt almost physically painful in my chest that I had not made an investment at all. I had made a donation to a cause that felt no obligation whatsoever to remember my name or my face or the price I had quietly, willingly paid for 30 years. I set the iPad down on the side table very carefully, the way you set down something you're afraid you might otherwise throw through a window. I sat in the dark living room for a long time after that, listening to the house creak around me, the way old wooden houses do at night, settling into themselves, and I made a decision that felt less like anger and more like a verdict finally handed down after a very long, very quiet trial I hadn't even realized I'd been sitting through for years. I decided I would not call Marshall again, not to explain what I'd seen, not to demand an answer, not to give him the chance to talk his way out of it with some smooth lawyer's excuse about optics or investments or family obligations that only ever seemed to flow in one direction, toward him, always toward him. If the county took the house, I decided, then the county would take the house, and I would find some quiet corner of the world to live out my remaining years in without asking my son for another single thing as long as I lived. I would rather sleep under a bridge with my dignity fully intact than spend one more day pretending I hadn't seen precisely who my son had become underneath that tailored suit. I did not know, sitting there in the dark with that photograph still glowing faintly on the screen beside me, that the story was nowhere close to over. I did not know that the very next night a knock would come at my door that would blow the entire rotten foundation of Marshall's carefully built life wide open, and that the man delivering that blow would be standing on my porch in the freezing dark, holding a small leather box containing the exact same watch I had just spent an hour of my life learning to hate, and that by morning everything I thought I understood about my son, and about the family I'd married him into would be lying in pieces on my kitchen table. The knock came just after 10 o'clock the following night, 3 sharp raps against a door that almost never got knocked on anymore. Not since Rosalind's church friends had stopped checking on me a few years back. I remember my first thought was foolish and small, that it was the county, somehow, already here to nail a notice to my door ahead of schedule. My second thought was that it might be a neighbor's kid selling something for a school fundraiser. I was not prepared in any sense for who was actually standing on my porch when I pulled the door open. Randolph Whitmore. In the flesh, on my sagging porch, in a coat that probably cost more than my mortgage payment, looking wildly, almost comically out of place against the peeling paint and the dead porch light I kept meaning to replace. He was not smiling. His face had the particular stillness of a man who had spent decades learning to control every muscle in it. And in his hand, held out slightly in front of him like an offering he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to make, was a small leather box I recognized immediately. "Mr. Langley," he said, his voice flat, careful, entirely unlike the warm public voice I remembered from Marshall's wedding toast. "I think we need to talk. May I come in?" I stood there for a moment, genuinely too stunned to answer, before stepping aside and letting the most powerful man I'd ever personally met walk into my small, cluttered living room, past the stack of student essays I'd never quite managed to give up grading in retirement, past the photograph of Rosalind on the shelf, into a home that had never once, in years, seen a guest of any kind arrive after dark. He didn't sit. He set the leather box down on my coffee table with a deliberate, almost ceremonial precision, flipped it open. And there it was. The Rolex Daytona, gold and gleaming, exactly as it had looked in that magazine photograph, except now it was sitting in my living room like a piece of evidence at a crime scene, rather than a trophy at a gala. "Your son gave me this 4 days ago," Randolph said, still standing, still radiating the particular coldness of a man accustomed to delivering bad news from a position of total control. "I want you to know exactly where it came from, because I don't believe he's told you the truth. And frankly, Mr. Langley, I think you've earned the truth a long time ago." I noticed, in that first stunned minute, how tired he looked underneath the composure, not the polished tiredness of a man who'd had a long flight, but something older and heavier, the look of a man recalculating everything he thought he understood about his own household. He glanced once around my living room, at the worn armchair, the stack of essays, the modest little television I'd owned for over a decade, and something flickered across his face that I could not quite name. Not pity exactly, something closer to recognition. I asked him, my voice barely working, why any of this was suddenly his concern. He looked at me for a long moment before answering, and when he did, there was something almost weary underneath the coldness. "Because I built my entire fortune on knowing exactly who I'm dealing with before I hand them anything of value," he said. "I did not know who I was dealing with. I do now. And I don't like being made a fool of in front of 200 people at my own birthday party, Mr. Langley, even less than I dislike being lied to." What followed took perhaps 20 minutes, though it felt considerably longer, and I have replayed every single second of it more times than I could ever count since. Randolph told me, in a voice that never once rose above a controlled, contemptuous monotone, that Marshall was not, in fact, the man he had spent years presenting to the world. That behind the corner office and the tailored suits was a mountain of quiet debt, leveraged investments that had gone sideways badly, and a desperate, grasping hunger to secure a permanent seat on the board of Whitmore Realty Group before his shaky position in the family could ever be seriously questioned by anyone with real influence. And to buy that seat, to purchase Randolph's loyalty and silence in one elegant, glittering gesture, Marshall had done something I still, even now, find genuinely difficult to say out loud. He had drained $150,000 from Oliver's education trust fund, His own son's trust fund, money set aside since the boy's birth, meant to be untouchable, meant to secure a 6-year-old's future decades from now, quietly liquidated through a series of paperwork maneuvers only a corporate lawyer would know how to execute cleanly, and funneled into a watch, a performance, a bribe dressed up as a sentimental birthday gift for the cameras. I sat down hard on my own couch when Randolph told me that part, because my legs genuinely stopped agreeing to hold me upright. I thought of the mason jar labeled for Dad. I thought of Rosalind's insurance money, spent so I could hand Marshall a future. And now this, a little boy's future, stolen by the very same hands that had once been too small to reach the top shelf in our old kitchen, now large enough, apparently, to rob his own child without a single flicker of visible hesitation. But Randolph was not finished. He looked at me with something that might have almost been pity, if a man like him were capable of something so soft, and delivered the second blow of the night. "There's something else you should know," he said, lowering himself finally into the armchair across from me, as though he understood I would need to be sitting for what came next. "For 7 years, my daughter has asked why she's never met your side of the family properly. Marshall's answer was always the same, word for word, every single time. He told us you were a compulsive gambler, Mr. Langley, that you'd bled your family dry at the tables, drank through what little was left, and that you'd tried more than once to extort money out of him under the threat of embarrassing him publicly at events. He told us you were dangerous to be around, unpredictable, someone Isabel should never be left alone with. That's why you were never invited to anything. That's why my daughter has spent 7 years feeling sorry for a man she believed was a con artist and a drunk, instead of getting to know the father who apparently sold his dead wife's life insurance just to put that same son through law school. I don't have adequate words even now for what that revelation did to me. Every slight I had swallowed, every silent Thanksgiving spent alone with Rosalind's photograph, every excuse I'd forced myself to accept as the ordinary cost of a son's success, none of it had ever been distance born of ordinary shame or busy schedules. It had been an active, deliberate campaign of character assassination, carefully constructed and meticulously maintained for 7 straight years, engineered to keep a good man permanently exiled from his own son's new life, in case the truth of who had actually sacrificed everything ever slipped out and complicated the story Marshall was so carefully selling everyone who mattered to him. 2 old men sat in that dim, quiet living room for a long time after Randolph finished talking, a billionaire and a retired school teacher, standing at opposite ends of the entire American social ladder, united, suddenly and completely, by the exact same devastating discovery. We had both, in our own separate and painful ways, spent years feeding a parasite we had each mistaken for a son. And for the first time since that magazine photograph had lit up my screen 2 nights earlier, I understood with a clarity that felt almost violent in its suddenness that this story was no longer going to end quietly, with me simply losing a house. Before he left that night, Randolph paused at my door, the leather box back in his coat pocket, and said one more thing I would carry with me for the rest of my life. "I don't do things quietly, Mr. Langley," he said. "When someone tries to make a fool of me, I make sure the entire room understands exactly what happened. You'll want to be there when it does. I'll be in touch." Then he walked back out into the cold, got into a car that looked like it cost more than my house had ever been worth, even before the mortgage, and drove off into the dark, leaving me standing in my doorway with a version of my son's life I could never again unknow. Randolph paid the $3,000 the very next morning. He didn't ask me to accept it, didn't frame it as charity, simply had a check delivered by courier with a single line attached. "Don't thank me. Consider this the price of admission to a show." I understood, reading that note at my kitchen table, exactly what kind of show he meant, and some cold, patient part of me, a part I hadn't known existed until that week, began for the first time in my life looking forward to something with genuine, quiet, almost frightening anticipation. The occasion was Whitmore Realty Group's 10th anniversary gala, held at a ballroom so grand it made the wedding venue look modest by comparison. Crystal chandeliers hanging like frozen waterfalls, a jazz quartet in the corner, waiters weaving through hundreds of the kind of people whose names appear in the very magazine that had first betrayed Marshall to me. Randolph had arranged everything with the precision of a man who built skyscrapers for a living and left absolutely nothing, not one single detail, to chance. He had a car sent for me. He had a suit tailored and delivered to my door. The first suit I'd owned in 20 years that hadn't come off a discount rack, cut so well I barely recognized my own reflection in the hotel elevator mirror. And he had, without telling anyone, arranged for me to wait in a private room just off the main ballroom until the moment he decided was right. I watched the gala unfold from that room through a narrow gap in the door, my heart beating in a way it hadn't in years. And I watched my son take the stage roughly an hour in, microphone in hand, utterly at ease in front of a crowd that size, the way only a man who has spent years perfecting his own performance can be. He talked about family. He talked with a straight face about the values that had built Whitmore Realty Group into what it was: honesty, loyalty, the kind of trust that gets passed down through generations of a well-run family business. I listened to my own son use the word integrity 3 separate times in a 5-minute speech, watched 200 people nod along and raise their glasses to him, and something in my chest, some last stubborn ember of hope that this was all some enormous misunderstanding I could still forgive, finally went out for good. Randolph waited until Marshall reached the closing line of his speech, something about how family was the truest measure of a man's success, before he walked calmly onto that stage himself, took the microphone directly out of my son's hand with a smile that did not come close to reaching his eyes, and turned to face the crowd with the easy authority of a man who owned the room and everyone standing in it. "Before we move on to dinner," Randolph said, his voice carrying easily across the entire ballroom, cutting through the last polite ripple of applause like a blade through silk, "I'd like to add a footnote to my son-in-law's excellent speech about family values." A screen behind him flickered to life, and there, projected 20 feet high for 200 of the city's most influential people to see, was a bank statement. Oliver's trust fund, the withdrawal, the date, the amount, in stark black numbers nobody in that room could pretend not to read. $150,000. The room went silent in a way I have never heard a room go silent before or since. Not a gasp, not a murmur, just a total, suffocating stillness. The sound of 200 perfectly composed people simultaneously recalculating everything they thought they understood about the man standing frozen at center stage under a spotlight that suddenly felt like an interrogation lamp. "This is a withdrawal from my grandson's education trust," Randolph continued, each word landing like a hammer strike against glass, "made without his mother's knowledge, 4 days before Marshall gave me a Rolex Daytona at my own birthday party. I've spent the past several days deciding what to do with that information. I've decided the fairest thing is simply to share it with the same people my son-in-law just spent 5 minutes telling how much he values honesty." The chandeliers above him seemed to burn even brighter in that silence, as if the entire room itself had turned into a courtroom waiting on a verdict. Marshall's face, even from where I stood, had gone the color of old paper. He opened his mouth. I watched him actually try, to find some smooth lawyer's phrase that could talk this particular jury back from the edge, some deflection that had worked on smaller rooms his entire career. And nothing came out. Nothing at all. For the first time in years, I watched my son stand in front of a crowd and have absolutely no performance left to give him cover. A man near the front, someone I later learned sat on the board Marshall had been so desperate to join, stood up from his table without a word and simply walked out of the ballroom. his wife following a half step behind him, her heels echoing sharply against the marble floor. 2 more tables did the same within the next minute. Nobody shouted. Nobody needed to. In that world I was learning, disgrace doesn't arrive with noise. It arrives with the quiet, deliberate sound of chairs sliding back and doors closing. That was when Randolph turned, found me in the doorway, and gestured for me to step forward into the light. I want to describe that walk to you as carefully as I can, because I have thought about it every day since it happened. I walked out onto that stage in a tailored suit that fit me properly, for the first time in my adult life, into a spotlight brighter than anything I'd ever stood under in 40 years of classrooms, past 200 strangers whose entire understanding of me had been built entirely out of my son's lies. I was not the broke, dangerous gambler Marshall had spent 7 years describing to protect his own image. I stood there clean, composed, and utterly unafraid, and I watched my son's face when he finally recognized me across that stage. Not confusion, not relief, but something closer to pure horror, the horror of a man watching 2 separate, carefully maintained lies collide head-on in the same room at the same moment, with absolutely no lawyer's trick left in his arsenal to survive the wreckage of either one. Isabel found her voice before anyone else in that room did. She walked straight up to her husband, in front of every single person who mattered to his career, and asked him one question in a voice that cracked down the middle like ice under too much weight. Is any of it true? The gambling? The drinking? The threats? Any of it at all? Marshall didn't answer. He couldn't. His silence answered for him, loud enough for the entire ballroom to hear echoing off the chandeliers. What happened next took less than 5 seconds, but I suspect it will be talked about at every one of Randolph Whitmore's future events for years to come. Isabel slapped her husband hard in front of 200 witnesses and at least a dozen phones that were already recording every second of it. Nobody moved to stop her. Nobody moved to comfort him. I watched a room full of powerful, calculating people simply turn their backs on my son, one table at a time, the way a tide pulls away from something it's finally decided isn't worth keeping anymore. Marshall Langley, who had spent 7 patient years constructing a perfect, glittering lie, watched every piece of it collapse in a single humiliating minute, live, in front of the exact audience he had sacrificed everything, including his own son's future, to impress. He stood alone at the center of that stage for what must have been 30 full seconds. No wife beside him, no father-in-law behind him, no colleague willing to meet his eyes, the microphone still clutched uselessly in his hand, as though he might somehow still find the right closing argument to win this particular jury back. I did not say a single word to him that night. I didn't need to. I simply stood there, in a suit that finally fit, next to the 2 men, one a billionaire, one a school teacher, who had both been foolish enough to trust him, and let the silence between us say everything I'd spent 40 years teaching bored teenagers that words too often failed to say adequately on their own. Somewhere behind me, I heard Randolph murmur, quiet enough that only I could hear it, that the show was over. But for Marshall, I understood even then, standing alone under that spotlight, with his wife's handprint still burning red on his cheek, the real reckoning hadn't even started yet. The consequences arrived quickly after that night, the way avalanches always seem sudden to the people standing at the bottom, even though the snow had been shifting for years above them. Whitmore Realty Group's board voted, unanimously and without a single dissenting voice, to sever every remaining tie to Marshall within a week. The State Bar Association opened a formal investigation into the trust fund withdrawal within days of a complaint quietly filed on Oliver's behalf, and by the following spring, my son's license to practice law had been suspended pending further proceedings that everyone in that ballroom already understood the outcome of. Isabel filed for divorce before the month was out, and her lawyers, some of the sharpest in the city, made sure the custody arrangement kept Marshall at arm's length from Oliver until he could prove, through actual supervised visits and actual accountability, that he deserved to be trusted around his own son again. The apartment went next, then the car, then, according to a mutual acquaintance who still occasionally passed along news I never asked for, a string of short-term sublets in increasingly modest neighborhoods, each one a little further from the glittering world he'd spent 7 years clawing his way into. I want to tell you that watching all of this happen brought me some kind of clean, uncomplicated satisfaction. It didn't, not entirely. There is no version of watching your only child's life collapse that arrives free of grief, no matter how thoroughly he earned every single brick of that collapse himself. I spent those weeks in a strange, suspended state, relieved that the truth was finally out in the open where it belonged, and mourning, quietly and privately, a son I understood now I had perhaps never really known at all, not even when he was small enough to fit in the crook of my arm. I went back to my house, the house Randolph had saved, and I sat in Rosalind's kitchen more evenings than I care to admit, talking to her photograph the way I hadn't allowed myself to in years, telling her everything, apologizing for things that weren't entirely my fault, and forgiving myself, slowly, for things that were. Randolph called me twice in the weeks that followed, not to gloat, which surprised me, but to check in the clipped, businesslike way I imagine he checked in on everything that mattered to him. He told me, on the second call, that Oliver had been asking about the nice man from the party, meaning me, and asked, somewhat awkwardly, for a man so rarely awkward about anything, whether I might be interested in spending time with my grandson properly, the way I never got the chance to when Marshall was busy hiding me from his new life, like an unflattering photograph he'd rather no one saw. I said yes before he'd even finished the sentence. That's how I found myself, on a cold evening about a month later, sitting by a fireplace in a home considerably grander than my own, with a 6-year-old boy curled up beside me under a blanket, both of us holding mugs of hot chocolate that Randolph had made himself, badly, with far too many marshmallows, the way I imagine a man who has spent his whole life running an empire rarely gets the chance to make anything at all with his own 2 hands. Oliver asked me questions about his father, in the careful, testing way children do when they sense a subject is delicate, but haven't yet learned to leave it alone. I answered him honestly, as gently as I could, the way I used to answer my most difficult students when a lesson touched too close to something painful in their own lives. I told him his father loved him, because whatever else Marshall had done, I believed that much was still true underneath all the wreckage. I told him some grown-ups make choices that hurt the people who love them, and that none of it, not one single particle of it, was Oliver's fault to carry on those small shoulders. Randolph became, in those weeks, an unlikely constant in my life. We were an odd pair by any measure, a billionaire who had built half a skyline, and a retired teacher who still drove a car with a check engine light that never turned off. But grief, I've learned, doesn't care much about a man's tax bracket. We'd sit some evenings after Oliver went to bed, 2 old men by a fire, talking about everything and nothing, and more than once he told me, with a bluntness I'd come to appreciate, that he envied the 40 years I'd spent actually knowing my son, misguided as that knowing eventually turned out to be because he himself had spent Isabel's whole childhood too buried in boardrooms to notice how well Marshall had been grooming himself into her life. It was on one of those snowy nights, nearly 2 months after the gala, that I heard a car pull up outside my own house. I recognized the sound before I even looked out the window. An old, struggling engine, nothing like the smooth German cars Marshall had been driving for the past decade. I looked out and saw him sitting in a battered second-hand sedan at the curb, engine idling, for almost 10 full minutes before he finally worked up the nerve to get out. He knocked. I opened the door and found my son standing on my porch, in a coat too thin for the weather, looking smaller somehow than I remembered him, the polish and confidence that had defined him for years entirely stripped away, leaving something closer to the frightened boy who used to climb into my lap during thunderstorms and refuse to come out until they passed. He was thinner. His eyes were red-rimmed in a way that told me he hadn't been sleeping, and hadn't, from the look of him, been eating much either. "Dad," he said, his voice cracking on the single syllable, "please, I have nowhere else to go. I know what I did. I know I don't deserve this, but please, just let me come in. Just for tonight. I'm your son." I stood in that doorway for a long moment, snow drifting sideways in the porch light, looking at the man who had once been the boy I bled myself dry to raise, the boy who saved birthday money in a mason jar labeled "for Dad," the boy whose acceptance letter sound I could still hear clearly in my memory after all these years, the boy I had loved so completely and so blindly that I never once stopped to ask what all that giving was actually building underneath the surface. I thought about the $3,000. I thought about the Rolex, gleaming under 100 camera flashes. I thought about 7 years of carefully constructed lies designed to keep a father exiled from his own grandson's life. Also, a stranger's approval could feel a little more secure at a boardroom table. I thought about a trust fund drained dry for a wristwatch, about a little boy asleep by a fireplace 2 towns over, who deserved, at the very least, a father who had actually learned something real from all of this, rather than simply learning how to ask for one more chance. "Why now, Marshall?" I asked him, and I meant it as an honest question, not a trap. Not why do you need somewhere to sleep? Why here? Why me, after 7 years of telling everyone who mattered to you that I was a danger to be kept away from your family? He didn't have an answer. Or rather, he had several, and none of them held together for more than a sentence before collapsing under their own weight, the same way every excuse he'd ever offered me eventually did. I watched him search for the right closing argument, the one that had always worked before, on judges, on partners, on Isabel, on me, and I watched him realize, standing there in the snow, that there wasn't one left in him that I hadn't already heard and already forgiven far too many times. I did not raise my voice. I did not slam the door in fury, because fury, I had learned over the past 2 months, was never really the point of any of this. I simply looked at my son, this stranger wearing a face I used to know better than my own, and I spoke to him the way I used to speak to a student handing in a failing paper for the 3rd time, past the point where kindness alone could still fix anything real. "Family doesn't just mean blood, Marshall," I said quietly. "It means showing up. It means telling the truth, even when the truth costs you something you don't want to pay. You had 40 years to learn that lesson from me, and you spent every single one of them learning the opposite instead. This house is closed to you now. Not forever, maybe. I honestly don't know yet, and I won't pretend to you that I do. But not tonight. You don't get to walk back in here just because everywhere else finally ran out of doors." I closed the door. Gently, not with the slam some part of me might have wanted years ago, back when I still believed anger could fix what patience alone had failed to. Through the frosted glass I watched his silhouette stand there for a long moment, unmoving, before it finally turned and walked slowly back toward that battered old car at the curb, his shoulders bent against the snow in a way I had never once seen them bend in 7 years of watching him carry himself like a man who owned every room he ever walked into. I want to tell you that closing that door broke something in me. It didn't. What I felt, standing alone in my own hallway with the porch light glowing faintly through the glass, was something closer to relief. The particular hard-won relief of a man who has finally, after a lifetime of confusing sacrifice with love, learned the difference between the two. I turned from the door and walked back toward the living room, where the fireplace was still burning low and warm. Randolph was sitting in the armchair that had somehow, over the past 2 months, become permanently his, and Oliver was curled up on the couch under a blanket, half asleep already, a half-finished mug of that too-sweet hot chocolate balanced carefully on the side table beside him. Neither of them asked who had been at the door. I think somehow they already knew and understood, without needing a single word from me, that it wasn't a conversation for tonight. I lost a son that winter. I understand that clearly now, and I've made a kind of uneasy peace with it, the way you eventually make peace with any grief that refuses to fully leave you, no matter how much time passes. But sitting there that night, watching a fire burn low, in a house that finally, truly felt like a home again, surrounded by a stubborn old billionaire who had somehow become the closest thing to a friend I had left in the world, and a little boy who trusted me with the easy, uncomplicated trust only children still have left to give an old man. I understood something else too, something that mattered far more in the end than anything I'd lost that year. I hadn't just lost a son. I had, against every expectation I carried into that terrible winter, finally found a family. One built for the first time in my life on nothing but the truth, and on people who showed up simply because they wanted to, not because 40 years of sacrifice had quietly obligated them to.